On September 11th, 2001, our American way of life was attacked. Everyone remembers where they were that day and how their lives changed from that moment on. The American Legion is committed to honoring the memories of those we lost on 9/11 and in the global war on terrorism that followed. As part of that commitment, the American Legion Tango Alpha Lima podcast presents a special series, 9/11-20-20-20. 20 episodes in the 20 days leading up to the 20th anniversary of the attacks that changed the world. Each of the 20 guests delivers a unique, first-hand perspective on 9/11 and our nation's response. Here is one of those remarkable stories.
And now we are joined by John Paluska. On September 11, 2001, John was an 18-year-old freshman at Fordham University. That day and in the days that followed, John volunteered at Ground Zero, aiding in the rescue and recovery operation. He subsequently joined the Army, becoming a Green Beret with combat deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and other locations. A Purple Heart recipient, John medically retired from the military after 10 years of service. He currently works at Bank of America Securities, structured finance with a focus on environmental, social, and governance, and is heavily involved with the company's military veteran hiring. We appreciate that, certainly. John is earning his MBA from Columbia Business School, where he has been active in their nonprofit board leadership program. He's a former State Department intern and joint fellow with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and U.S. Special Operations Command. He also serves on the fundraising committee for St. Jude's Hospital, Taste of Wall Street, and is a founding member of the Special Forces Association, Chapter 58. Welcome, John. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us here. But let's start with your 9/11 story. I mean, Fordham is right there, so you had to have known early what was happening.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. This is a great podcast series, and really appreciative that we continue to highlight as we're approaching the 20th anniversary here. I think my story is unique. Being location-wise, I'd just uprooted from Iowa in the Midwest. It was my 6th day of college. I didn't have classes on that Tuesday morning when 9/11 happened. I had a couple of roommates come rushing into my room. So I was sleeping in. They said, turn on the TV. We had those old 13-inch TVs with the cassette player, that was kind of built into it. And, I remember we're like, well, let's see if we can see what's going on. So we went to the top of another dormitory building, and, there it was, the second tower falling and the plume of smoke looking straight down into Manhattan. I brought a show and tell item here today, which I never pull out, but I actually had a Yankees ticket. I'm holding here a ticket for the 7:05 p.m. First pitch versus Chicago. And so, certainly that day, the game was canceled, and a number of days that baseball and all of America, focused on this tragic event. So what was going through my head? It's hard for me to kind of digest all of the emotions that I felt, because I was, a transplant from the Midwest. I, wasn't really fully, introduced to the New York, forget about it culture. But it immediately changed, where everyone was, this just full of love, compassion, and fear, and in shock. And I decided to jump on a subway and go down. I didn't know if there was anything I could do and help out, or where I would end up. And so that's what I did. It was a very eerie subway ride down there. I remember there being about 2 other people in the southbound, car. I think we got all the way down to around, 14th or 28th Street, and began walking, and, through the day, I found myself kind of, watching people running and crying, and ambulances and fire trucks. And it was just kind of this call to volunteer. I didn't know what I was walking into. I saw, vehicles and people covered in dust, coming up, northbound, and, trying to get, into Jersey, or, over to Brooklyn and Queens. And when I arrived at this location, as I was advancing towards Ground Zero, really not knowing, how I would help that day, someone asked me if I was part of this group called the Civilian Military Relief. Best to my knowledge, it was a group of, union workers who paired up with the National Guard units around New York City. And so the bridges, the tunnels were shut down. And, over the period of the next couple hours, we saw shipments of goods coming in. And we're a couple blocks north at this point. There's worries that there'd still be more collapses. So it was a very sensitive, time frame of whether we were going to go and aid or not. And of course, FDNY, NYPD, the PAPD just experienced some enormous casualties. And in the first 24 hours, I mean, you can imagine how exhausting and emotionally tired everyone was working through this war zone. I got outfitted alongside a couple of these workers and National Guardsmen, the full suit and boots and helmet, and we did the long walk to Ground Zero. We came in through the west side, and there's a number of different towers there, part of the World Trade Center, and we came in at a level that is not the ground floor, because it was just floors of debris. I spent most of my time on the west side, specifically the southwest side, and in that first day and going into September 12th, September 13th, I myself and the partner that I was with, we carried a garden spade, and we had a fireman's axe. As you can imagine, it was just still a scene of smoke and fire. We recovered, between him and I, about four victims. And here I am. I'm 18 years old. I'm 6 days into college. Come to kind of learn that I'm one of the youngest 9/11 rescue and recovery volunteers down there. And this was my kickoff to college. I wanted to go into the business, but this certainly changed my career trajectory. There's really, without going into the details, there's nothing that I can leave alone or put aside of my kind of tremendous desire to keep the memories of the victims alive forever. The camaraderie that I saw in New York City, the camaraderie I saw from my fellow friends in Iowa, printing American flags in the newspapers, American flags being on your pizza boxes, on your dry cleaning hangers. I mean, it was just this, the day after 9/11 was a really good day. And it was an awful event, and it still is an awful event today. But what I saw, come together on top of Ground Zero, and once I left about a week later, it just inspired me to kind of do so much and encourage people to stay connected. One thing that I think I'll be talking about is how I helped co-found the 9/11 Visionary Network. Looking for kind of the younger generation to form a network and continue to honor, remember those killed, commemorate September 11th, the community engagement through various education opportunities. So once about a month passed, as you can imagine, the entire school, the entire New York City was kind of upended. And I walked into a recruiter's office and said, "Hey, I want to enlist in the military." Gave me my options, and I went off and to basic training that next summer. I've stayed connected to 9/11, Ground Zero, the whole effort, the whole community, since 9/11. And when I was medically retired, I really didn't know what I wanted to do next, but I knew that I had unfinished business in New York City, and that's a big reason. Support from my wife, certainly to move back to New York from Joint Base Lewis McChord outside of Seattle, and help support those. So I'm heavily involved, giving tours, education opportunities. I think some of the stuff we're going to focus on is the burn pit initiatives pairing up with some of the other military nonprofits. So
Sure.
yeah, there's multiple layers in that story, and it's like a camera reel. Seeing, remembering the sirens, the smell, the American flags draping over all the different victims that we'd form a chain and pass along. But it was a struggle, for a nation on that day. We're stronger because of it. So many people are inspired because of it. We use the term post 9/11. I know there's some recent debate, whether we still use it, but I think for our generation and in these future generations, just as was Pearl Harbor, that is a term that defines me and many of you. And thank you for highlighting this important series.
Absolutely. All right, Ashley, you're up.
All right. Wow. I'm a very visual person. So I'm just like going through your story, and it's just very cinematic, very powerful. So John, you talk about, you're the youngest volunteer on Ground Zero to your knowledge, right? And you find yourself in a Army recruiter, station, or wherever you went. If they found you, you walked in, right? And you become a Green Beret, and you deploy to Afghanistan, Iraq. Tell us a little bit about your journey. Joining the military, right? You, let's see, you said what? Like summer after you started your freshman year. So I'm assuming you put school on hold, did your training, and then I want to just kind of peel back how you became a Green Beret, and your journey early on in your military career.
Yeah, I had a very untraditional military career, and I've learned to kind of give the elevator pitch on it. So I enlisted into the reserves, and subsequently disenrolled from the undergraduate business school. Kind of focused my educational studies on classes that aligned with just what I was doing. I was able to graduate on time. I don't tell many people this, or I don't really put on a resume, but I received a degree in individualized studies. Took some Arabic courses, took some history on the Middle East, some national policy coursework. That really drove me to understand why those events happened. And through the enlistment, being in the reserves, I wanted to take it a step further. So I did a program called Simultaneous Membership Program. It allowed me to come into ROTC later in my career, and I kind of sped up on credits. And so I actually graduated on time. And then I went off to in infantry, second lieutenant, did all the airborne ranger schools. Went to a unit that was deployed to Iraq. And my first of numerous deployments to come. It was my 13th day, and we were patrolling an area where we had just gotten into a very, very heavy fire with a number of casualties a week before, and I was my vehicle was struck with a rocket-propelled grenade. We went around a flank, and ultimately we took a type of IED called a explosive form projectile or penetrator, an EFP, a small Iranian bomb, and it went through my vehicle, took off my gunner's legs, Travis Strong. He survived, and then hit me with about 160 pieces of copper spalling, and so I, this is 13 days, so 6 days of college, 13 days on basically my first job in the military, and I had this tremendous setback. And when I was in recovery and going through knee and leg surgeries and hand surgeries, they had me work with casualties, and you wouldn't think that would be kind of the thing that you would do to someone who's been exposed to this trauma, and certainly over the years had a level of PTSD, but that taught me so much about compassion into my career, and what drove me to want to be a Green Beret. And we're not just these direct action guys kicking doors. I mean, we're there as a force multiplier. We're there to ultimately work ourselves out of a job to help people who need help. And, we want to, put them in a place where they can take care of a situation and take it on themselves. And so we're always trying to work ourselves out of a job. And, that's whether it's through, humanitarian deployments, teaching about, border security, or, being on the front lines, which, a large portion of my career was. That was that whole part of the beginning of my military career, being in a unit where I was the summary court marshal for inventory and personal effects of, a dozen soldiers, and assistant casualty assistance officer, when, really my only military career was 13 days overseas. I mean, that really shaped, that people are people. And I would never forget that. And I learned in my special forces training that the most important 3 words is respect costs nothing. And if you can apply that in everything that you do as a team or in a leadership position, it will help you so much to communicate. And Green Berets, we leverage a foreign language skill. And even if we sucked, or some of our teammates didn't speak the language, just taking the time to learn the culture about the people to help them out, because we're all human beings. It's kind of skipping the part about the 160 pieces of shrapnel and going on to serve my career. I actually did pretty well for a number of years. Had continued surgeries. I was a fighter, but a whole bunch of knee injections, shoulder injections, subsequent hand surgeries, ultimately led to the medical retirement. But I would go back to it in a heartbeat, if I could.
Wow. Thank you. Wow.
All right, Jeff, you are up.
Yeah.
You're on mute, but you are up.
I feel like you guys did that to me on purpose.
Yeah, you have to forgive him, John. He is a Marine, and so he doesn't understand how buttons work at times. So
we'll forgive the Marines. Yeah.
They're not in pretty. These buttons aren't in pretty colors, so it throws me off.
There's no drawing.
So how we're getting to my question is, you talked about 9/11 that day. You've talked about how 9/11 propelled you and inspired your service. And now what I want to talk to you about is, a lot of people say words like never forget. A lot of people say those kinds of words. You took everything from your service, your education, your experiences, you're coming from a small town, living in New York, and making that your new home. And you co-founded the 9/11 Memorial and Museum Visionary Network. So my question is about how that began and its mission, and when I go to New York next time, what is my experience going to be when I visit this?
Yeah, it began, I would say, naturally. I moved to New York, and in the summer of 2017, and I had counted how many times I had gone down to visit the memorial, and the first time I went down to the museum was a couple of years prior. But being in New York, I certainly had access. I was curious about the community that I had left. I was curious about other people's stories on 9/11, and that is probably the most incredible part about living in New York. A lot of comedians, talk about, hey, do you remember 9/11? I mean, like, for me and a lot of people, the calendar year is September 11th. It's not, like a kid on December 25th or, January 1st. Everything stops and projects forward from 9/11. And, I wanted to show that, this was an event that changed all Americans, all people living in America, changed the world. So I started giving tours, and, I just naturally connected to a number of folks at the memorial and museum, started running into some of the same people that are, part of different military communities. The military or the American Legion post here that Bill Golden runs, started doing a couple of events with them, and people just cared. They didn't know that there was such this magnificent museum that tells the story of why 9/11 happened and where we are today, underground, underneath those two pools that basically mirror the twin towers. I started meeting a couple of the family members at these events that were my age, Rob Peretta, Kate Levy, they lost his cousin, she lost her dad. We're around a similar age, we're doing the same things, and we just kind of casually on our own approached 9/11 Memorial Museum and said, hey, can we get kind of like this like junior board type together? And you think about it, 9/11 happened in 2001. You start a nonprofit, you put a board of directors together. Generally everyone's probably has experience, they're older in or mature in age, and now here we are 20 years later, or just before 20 years later, and you need that kind of injection of youth, and what does it mean to that next generation? And that's really kind of where the idea took off. And so it was a group of us, three who had lost family members, myself. We've grown to a formal leadership council of 6 individuals now, and we've got about 130 members within the Visionary Network. Really looking at the opportunities. I mean, the purpose is to kind of build that camaraderie. How to continue to remember the victims and highlight how all Americans, the world, came together to a call of duty. What the first responders, the FDNY were doing, and I care about this because it changed my life. It shaped my values. I saw the loss of life. I saw the acts of terrorism and how the events that day brought a lot of us together, which I kind of spoke about, is this more unified humanity. And whether it's me or someone that knew someone involved in 9/11, or just someone that gave prayers those day, or wasn't even born and is curious. I mean, that's really what we're here to help kind of advance forward, is the whole storyline around the next generation remembers.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's always eye-opening to hear from somebody who's had firsthand experience, and so we obviously appreciate you taking time out to kind of share it with us. It's important that everybody hear this and understand how much the world did change that day.
Yeah, everyone remembers. I mean, I could ask each one of you, where were you on that day? You will remember how you learned, when you heard the news, what you did for the rest of that day.
Yep.
And you think about how many days we've been alive. I mean, there's not many days that you can remember that along with so many other people.
Yeah, I don't remember yesterday, but I remember that day 20 years ago. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining us. Everyone else, remember to subscribe to the Tango Alpha Lima podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to them. When you're there, make sure you review and rate us. And if you want to send us some feedback, you can do that at tangoalphalima@legion.org. John, thank you again so much for joining us. We appreciate all the time you spent with us.
Yeah, thank you. And if you're 21 to 45 years old, please join 911memorial.org/visionary. Thank you again for all what you're doing and highlighting this important lead up to the 20th anniversary.